When US President Donald Trump announced tariffs against China, Canada, and Mexico, he felt confident that none would respond. How could they? They'd be poking the bear and incurring his wrath. What Trump never expected was a trade war that has significantly escalated in the last 24 hours. So now he's got one, and he's furious. Canada has just retaliated to Trump's tariffs with tariffs of its own, and the United States is shocked. What has Canada done? Why does it matter? And what does all of this mean for both countries in the future? It all started on February 1st. That's when the White House website published a press release stating that Trump intended to implement a 25% tariff against Canada and Mexico, along with a 10% additional tariff on China. Trump wasn't done with Canada either. He also announced a 10% tariff on the country's energy resources. Trump was taking this bold action to hold all three countries accountable for their roles in enabling illegal immigration and the flow of fentanyl into the United States. The announcement hit Canada hard. For over 150 years, the Great White North has had no closer ally than the United States. Literally, the US is Canada's neighbor to the south, with the two only being separated by a border that has traditionally been easy to cross. They're allies in trade, with the US importing $412.7 billion worth of goods from Canada in 2024, while exporting $349.4 billion to create total annual trade of over $760 billion. Plus, they're military allies, both are NATO members, along with having several military pacts between themselves. Trump's moves have threatened that alliance, but the threat didn't appear to last long. Just 2 days after the White House announced the tariffs against Canada, Trump agreed to a 30-day pause. This wasn't a capitulation to external or internal pressure, according to Trump, but instead, Trump agreed to a pause following an emergency phone call from Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. The Canadian leader agreed to reinforce Canada's border with the US to stamp out the fentanyl trade, which delivered a reprieve to his country. That reprieve was temporary. True to his word, Trump held fire for 30 days. Unfortunately for Canada, he chose not to extend the pause beyond that period. On March 3rd, Trump announced that the US will move forward on its tariffs against Canada and Mexico. No room left for Canada or Mexico, Trump claimed in the White House. The tariffs, they're all set. They go into effect tomorrow. Canada and the US had failed to reach a deal, according to the president. That meant Canada had to suffer the wrath of Trump's tariffs. But Trump has a problem. His tariffs have just been activated, just as he promised. However, Canada hasn't taken their implementation lying down. Rather than doing everything they can to cozy up to Trump and find a way to have him reverse his decision, Canada has done what Trump never expected. It's retaliated with tariffs of its own. On March 4th, Canada struck back against Trump, condemning his actions while announcing retaliatory tariffs. And it's not alone. Mexico's President Claudia Sheinbaum has also announced that she intends to retaliate if Trump's tariffs are still in place by March 8th. And just like Canada, China has responded to Trump by creating tariffs. All three caught Trump off guard. He expected his tariffs would force the nations to do America's bidding. Instead, he's just plunged the country into a trade war. This is a time to hit back hard and to demonstrate that a fight with Canada will have no winners, Trudeau claimed in a biting address on March 4th. Trudeau also had a message for Trump, addressing him as Donald, in a clear sign of disrespect caused by Trump calling Trudeau Canada's governor so many times. Canada's Prime Minister said, "You're a very smart guy, but this is a very dumb thing to do." Trudeau isn't just firing shots in the trade war, he's targeting Trump's ego. In a separate statement, the Canadian government explained what its tariffs would look like. The country intends to impose a 25% tariff on around $30 billion worth of unspecified American goods. That's a warning shot for Trump. If America's president doesn't lift his tariffs within the next 21 days, Canada will extend its 25% tariff to $125 billion worth of goods. That covers around a third of Canada's total imports from the United States, and Trudeau is likely willing to go further if Trump doesn't negotiate soon. China's response was just as shocking to Trump. It announced a 15% tariff on all imports of wheat, corn, chicken, and cotton from the US, in addition to a 10% tariff on other American agriculture products such as fruit, vegetables, and dairy. Mexico is the more cautious of the three. It's taking a wait-and-see stance, at least until March 8th. However, if Trump moves ahead with his tariffs, we can expect to see Mexico implement tariffs similar to those of China and Canada. So how will this affect things? Let's start by taking a look at the military. Trump's tariffs and the retaliations they've prompted could have a severe military impact. That's according to Defense News, which points out that Trump's tariffs reportedly include materials that are critical to America's defense supply chain. The new tariff war is intended to push American companies to expand the domestic production of these materials, such as steel and rare earths that are needed in modern microelectronics. Trump is pushing to make the US less dependent on foreign suppliers, but his tariffs may create a cascade of negative effects. As director of the Center for Defense Concepts and Technology at the Hudson Institute, Brian Clark tells Defense News it's going to cause prices to go up, and because these are commodities, if the prices go up because of these tariffs, that kind of affects everybody all at once. Just like oil, if you cut off a supply from one place or make a supply from one place more expensive, everybody else takes advantage, and the prices all go up everywhere. In other words, Trump's tariffs will make importing from Canada, Mexico, and China more expensive for everybody. Worse yet, other countries that aren't directly impacted by the tariffs will raise their prices as well, forcing the US to pay far more for the materials it needs to support its military while it tries to create domestic manufacturing. Trump is typically bullish on the issue. The higher the tariff, the more likely it is that the company will come to the United States and build a factory in the United States, so it doesn't have to pay the tariff, Trump claimed in October 2024 during an interview with Bloomberg. Only that's not what appears to be happening. Canada's decision to retaliate with tariffs of its own takes away the move to America argument for companies. No matter where businesses go, they're going to be impacted by this tariff war. On the American military front, that will manifest as higher prices for materials, leading to the US's already massive defense budget no longer stretching as far as it once did. So it's clear that the new tariff war is going to impact Canada and the US militarily. If they don't end up fighting outright, creating issues within NATO in the process, both will still have to deal with being forced to spend more to maintain their militaries. But what are the more immediate effects of Canada's unexpected decision to retaliate against Trump's tariffs? For one, Trump has created a more united Canada at a time when he seems to be trying to force a divide in the country. America's president might have hoped there would be voices within Canada who supported his tariffs and his desire to make Canada America's 51st state. Those voices don't exist. Instead, the New York Times claims that Trump's tariffs have created a sense of unity in a country that was previously divided along fierce political lines. Pierre Poilievre, who leads Canada's Conservative Party and is a rival to Trudeau, said, "President Trump stabbed America's best friend in the back in the wake of the 25% tariff being implemented." Ontario Premier Doug Ford has already ordered the removal of all US-made liquor from Canadian store shelves, along with cancelling a contract with Elon Musk's Starlink. Nova Scotia is also planning to remove American liquor from stores. Regardless of political divides, Canada seems to be coming together to fend off what it may see as a much bigger enemy, its former ally, the United States. There have also been severe financial ramifications to Trump's and Trudeau's announcements. As fears of a trade war rose, the US stock market responded by going into decline. The S&P 500 index, which tracks America's 500 biggest companies, fell for 2 days straight, reaching its lowest level since Trump won the American presidential election in November 2024. In addition to the S&P 500's 1.2% drop, the technology-focused NASDAQ fell by 0.35%, with the Dow Jones Industrial Average dropping by 1.5%. Some of America's best-known retailers were hit hard, with Best Buy seeing 13% wiped off its share price in the space of 2 days. Those financial issues are going to continue. As Best Buy's chief financial officer, Matt Bilunas, points out, the giant wildcard is obviously how consumers are going to react to the price increases in light of a lot of price increases potentially throughout the year. In other words, the tariff is already damaging the US economy, and it's going to lead to higher prices across multiple industries, especially now that Canada has responded with its own tariffs. Some believe they have a stronger financial future thanks to the tariffs. Polls are inconclusive over whether Americans favor Trump's tariffs, and the United Automobile Workers Union has defended Trump's decisions. The labor group claimed that the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement had caused American job losses for too long, with tariffs being the remedy. Tariffs are a powerful tool in the toolbox for undoing the injustice of anti-worker trade deals, claimed the group. We are glad to see an American president take aggressive action on ending the free trade disaster that has dropped like a bomb on the working class. Will the union be as glad now that Canada has announced its tariffs? That remains to be seen, and it could all come down to whether Trump is successful in attracting more companies to the US with his tariffs. He might have pulled it off if Canada hadn't retaliated. Now, the future is far murkier. Speaking of the future, what does it hold now the tariff wars are underway? It's difficult to say, though Trump has claimed that he's willing to go further. Posting to Truth Social in the wake of Trudeau's tariff announcement, Trump said, "Please explain to Governor Trudeau of Canada that when he puts on a retaliatory tariff on the US, our reciprocal tariff will immediately increase by a like amount." This appears to be a threat to impose a further 25% tariff on Canada in response, which would raise America's tariffs on the Great White North to 50%. Canada might again respond in kind, which would decimate the already shaken trade relationship it has with the US. Alternatively, Trump may be willing to do what he believes he does best: make a deal. Following Trump's Truth Social post, Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick proposed a more clear-headed way forward for the two countries. He suggested that Trump will probably announce a tariff pact with Canada and Mexico that could lead to a compromise. Lutnick also says that Canada and Mexico had been on the phone with him all day, trying to show that they'll do better and the president's listening. Lutnick appears to be acting as though Trump still holds all the cards, with Canada and Mexico being the two nations begging for a resolution. But what if things got desperate enough to cause an actual war between the US and its northern neighbor? Let's look at how recent comments could play into this hypothetical, albeit unlikely, scenario. Trump has continued his mockery of Canada's Prime Minister, once again referring to him as governor, while claiming that Canada should be subsumed into the US and become the 51st state. Rather than shrugging these supposed jokes off as he has in the past, Trudeau came firing back with a direct accusation against Trump. Perhaps he wants to sink the Canadian economy so that he can annex Canada, Trudeau said on March 4th. That's never going to happen. We will never be the 51st state. Trudeau also accused Trump of trying to jettison America's closest friends and allies, in addition to drawing some interesting contrasts between Trump's tariffs and his increasing closeness with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Trudeau referred to Canada as America's closest partner and ally, while calling Putin a lying, murderous dictator. Trudeau seems to be implying that Trump has fallen under the sway of a man who's supposed to be America's biggest enemy. If that's the case, as Trudeau seems to be claiming, then Canada will be prepared to fight to retain its freedom if Trump is really serious about making Canada the 51st state. On paper, it's a fight that Canada can't hope to win. According to military aggregator Global Firepower, or GFP, the US beats Canada in every single major category of war. America's population is almost 10 times the size of Canada's, giving it a manpower advantage of over 111 million people that GFP classes as fit for service. The manpower picture doesn't get any prettier for Canada when you look at active duty and reserve military personnel. The US has 1.328 million active soldiers and 799,500 reserves. Canada's numbers are tiny in comparison, just 68,000 active soldiers and 27,000 reserves. That discrepancy is seen everywhere. Canada's defense budget amounts to around 5% of what America spends on its military each year. The country's air force only has 351 assets compared to 13,043 that the US Air Force commands. Canada's 74 tanks and 21,704 armored vehicles aren't going to be much help in a ground war when the US has 4,640 tanks and over 391,000 armored vehicles that it can bring to the fight. Canada fares no better on the naval front. The US has 440 naval assets, including 11 aircraft carriers and a terrifying fleet of 81 destroyers and 70 submarines. Canada's navy is around a sixth of the size. It also has no aircraft carriers, giving it fewer options for how to use its aerial assets, no destroyers, and only 4 submarines. Oh, and the United States has 5,225 nuclear weapons. Canada has none. It's about as one-sided a conflict as you could have, despite Canada's massive size. If Trump decides to annex the Great White North, his US military should be able to run roughshod over the relatively feeble Canadian defense. Canada will be hit hard by its past alliance with the US. What does it do when the country it trusted to defend it becomes Canada's aggressor? Perhaps it could call on NATO. Under Article 5 of the NATO Charter, all NATO members are duty-bound to come to the defense of any singular member who experiences an attack on its own soil. The US attempt to annex Canada would certainly constitute an attack that would traditionally trigger Article 5. However, there's the added complication of the US being one of the founding members of NATO to consider. The question is, how would NATO respond to the attempted annexation? It's difficult to say one way or the other, but Trump hasn't done the United States any favors with the Collective Defense Organization in the past. He's constantly criticized NATO members for not hitting the organization's recommended defense spending target of 2% of gross domestic product, or GDP, particularly before his second stint as US president. In February 2024, he also said he would encourage Russia to attack any NATO member failing to hit that GDP target. Referencing a conversation he had with another NATO leader during a South Carolina rally, Trump also suggested that the US wouldn't come to the aid of underpaying countries that Putin targets. He claimed the leader asked Trump if the US would come to their country's aid if they were attacked. Trump's response was blunt. "I said, you didn't pay? You're delinquent? No, I would not protect you. In fact, I would encourage them to do whatever they want. You gotta pay." Comments like these have already created a thorny relationship between Trump and many of his NATO allies. Some who have worked with the US president in the past also believe that withdrawal from NATO is high on his agenda. That includes former US National Security Advisor John Bolton, who believes it's highly probable that Trump will try and withdraw the United States from NATO. Speaking to British outlet LBC, Bolton added that he believes Trump's attempts to move the spending goalposts is a sign of his intentions. Referring to comments made by Trump on January 8th that NATO members should be aiming for 5% of GDP spending on defense, Bolton said, "First, Trump said back in his initial term, well, all of these Europeans are not spending 2% of GDP on defense. Now he's saying you need to spend 5% of GDP on defense. But I suspect there's almost no country in Europe, maybe the Baltics and Poland and a few others, that will go to 5%. So in a year when it doesn't happen, Trump will be able to say, NATO is just as worthless as I always said it was, I'm getting out." What could that mean if Trump does try to annex Canada? If he withdraws the US from NATO, any attack on Canadian soil would push the rest of NATO's members into a war with the US. Even if Trump doesn't withdraw, he's said so many inflammatory things about the organization's members that they may choose to take up arms against the US anyway to support Canada. If they do, Canada's manpower and equipment disadvantages fade into the background. Even without the US, NATO has 1.5 million active military personnel. That version of NATO also has thousands of modern battle tanks, advanced jet fighters, and equipment which would make it a match for the United States. Plus, a NATO that doesn't include the US still brings nukes to the fight. The UK and France combined to have an arsenal of 515 nuclear weapons. That may only be roughly a tenth of what the US would bring to a fight over Canada, but it's still enough to cause some serious damage. But of course, this is just speculation. The reality may be that Trump never expected Canada to retaliate with its own tariffs, and now America's president has to deal with an emerging trade war that could have massive ramifications for the US, Canada, global trade, and an alliance that has stood for well over a century. But what do you think about Canada's retaliatory tariffs? Will they force Trump to change his approach to the Great White North? Or are we seeing the start of a trade war that could intensify into something much worse in the future? Let us know in the comments and subscribe to The Military Show for all of the latest news about Trump's tariffs.